Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today we're going outside my comfort zone, leaving the Middle East behind to travel to ancient India. We're going to look at the Battle of the 10 Kings, which took place sometime in the 14th century BCE. And before we dive in, I want to offer a disclaimer. This is an area and a period of history I know very little about. If you really want to know about the history of Vedic India, you should check out my sources for starters. Then look at their sources if you really want to dive deep. And if you know something about this period of Indian history, I'd love to hear from you. Now, it probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm going to butcher these pronunciations. Please be patient with me. So as we often do, we're going to start with some historical context, especially since this is the first time we've been to India. India today is the 7th largest country in the world by land area and the largest by population. Now, I had always heard it was the second most populous country behind China, but in doing my research for this war story, I learned India's population surpassed China's in 2023. So it is now the biggest. And I have learned something new, so I can go home now. Oh wait, I'm already home. Well, in that case, let's keep going, shall we? So as we always do, we're going to spend a minute looking at the terrain and climate of India, since we've never been here before. In the north, India sits inside part of the world's highest mountain range, the Himalayas. This is the most temperate part of the country, warm in the valleys and cool at the high altitudes. South of the mountains, you get into tropical climates. Afghanistan and Pakistan to the west sit up in the Hindu Kush Mountains, and the rain shadow from those creates the Thar Desert in the far northwest of India. A rain shadow, if you didn't know, is a dry climate region caused because rising warm air tends to dump its moisture on one side of a mountain range, which means when it gets to the other side, it doesn't have any moisture left to drop there. So air moving west to east across Central Asia drops its moisture in Iran and Afghanistan before it gets to Pakistan or India. But as you move east from the Thar Desert, you get into an arid steppe area, then a tropical climate. Northeast India, south of the mountains, has a climate similar to Southeast Asia. That's Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Moving south from there, you run into a tropical savanna region. And south of that, you have a tropical climate on the west coast and another steppe area running up the center of the country. Most of India sits in the tropics. So instead of cool and warm seasons, you're going to have more or less stable temperatures year-round, punctuated by what's called a monsoon, which is a seasonal rain cycle that brings heavy rains and flooding from about June to about October, and drier weather the rest of the year. The area we're looking at today is in the extreme northwest part of the country, right on the border with Pakistan, which is going to be a mountainous, relatively arid steppe area. Because today's battle happened near the Sutlej River, which runs southwest out of the mountains and eventually joins the Indus in Pakistan. So that's the climate and the terrain. What kind of cultures are we looking at in this area? Well, when I was in school, I learned India was full of ignorant Stone Age people until the Aryans came in and created a great Bronze Age culture. But we've been doing these shows together for a few months now, so by now you know I'm not going to leave it at that. Because the evidence actually shows that there was a huge, thriving culture in Pakistan and northwest India in the Bronze Age. The Indus Valley Civilization, the IVC, was every bit as densely populated and sophisticated as the civilizations that grew up in Mesopotamia and Egypt. They left ruined cities all up and down the Indus Valley, the largest of which you may have heard of, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These cities were as big as the cities we've looked at on the Tigris and Euphrates, with populations somewhere between 30 and 60,000 people. I've seen people suggesting that the IVC was a peaceful culture, that they didn't have war or even violent crime. And you're welcome to believe that if you want, but I don't buy it. Because judging by the remains found in IVC graves, these people were human. Some of the bodies show the marks of violence, so we can't say for sure they fought wars, but it seems pretty likely to me. Anyway, the IVC thrived from about 3300 BCE to about 1300 BCE, but the archaeological record shows evidence of decline starting in about 1800 BCE. There's a theory that the IVC spread outward into Central Asia sometime around this period, which might explain some of the similarities we see between the Bronze Age cultures of India and Iran. But if you're living in a fertile river valley surrounded by mountains on two sides, desert on the third, and the ocean to the south, you need a pretty good reason to leave. It seems much more likely to me that others would have migrated in than that the IVC would have migrated out. And that's the prevailing theory. People from Central Asia, east of the Caspian Sea, started migrating out of the steppe in about 2000 BCE. Some of them headed southeast across the Hindu Kush into the Indus Valley, bringing domesticated horses and new technologies like chariots and composite bows with them. It was much more likely a migration than an invasion, which is how I learned about it in school. But a large enough migration is going to be a huge culture-changing event for whoever lives in the area already, even if the people moving in don't have any interest in killing and looting. So the Aryans moved in, and they stayed, and became the Indo-Aryans, which is probably not what they called themselves. And the archaeology of the IVC started showing their influence. And sometime later, somebody created one of the earliest written texts in the world, a scripture called the Rigveda. Now, the Rigveda is one of a collection of documents called the Vedas. You might have heard them called the Vedic texts, which give us both the early history of India and the roots of Hinduism. We haven't talked much about religion in the context of Mesopotamia or Egypt, mostly because those religions and the cultures they grew up in don't exist anymore. But Hinduism is still with us, and it's the biggest religion in the biggest country in the world. So we need to at least acknowledge how important the Vedas are to India and Indian history. But I'm sure not going to represent myself as an expert on Hinduism. If I can rise to the level of a respectful amateur scholar, that'll be fine with me. Basically, the Vedas are Indian history up until about 500 BCE. Little like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Old Testament, the writings of Homer, and the Chinese legends, the Vedas give us an idea of what the people of the region considered big events. And like Gilgamesh and Homer and the Chinese legends, the Vedas were an oral history until somebody wrote them down. There are 4 of them, and the Rigveda is the oldest of the 4, and the story of today's battle comes from the Rigveda. So, we've covered Indian geography and climate, and we've looked at the cultural context of today's battle. Let's talk a little bit about armies and equipment might have looked like in this period. First of all, the Battle of the Ten Kings took place sometime between 1450 and 1300 BCE. That's a little like saying the Battle of Gettysburg took place sometime between 1750 and 1900. It's not very helpful. I mean, there was probably a lot less in terms of social change and technological improvement between 1450 and 1300 BCE than there was between 1750 and 1900 CE, but that's still a big window. And unfortunately, it's about the best dating we have. Just like Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Indus Valley was in its Bronze Age in this period. This region may have actually started using iron weapons earlier than Mesopotamia did. There's some evidence that they were using iron around 1200 BCE, where the Assyrians didn't start equipping their armies with iron weapons on a large scale until about the 900s BCE. But even if that's accurate, it's still at least a century in the future. So bronze it is. I don't see anything in any of my sources that indicates any kind of a technological difference between the two sides we're going to look at today. Which makes sense. If the Aryans brought horses and chariots and composite bows sometime around the 1800s BCE, by 1450 you can imagine pretty much everybody in the region has them. So that's what we're going to assume for this war story. Ancient Indian armies in the Vedic period were divided into 4 general branches: infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. The infantry would have looked a lot like the infantry of Mesopotamia. Lightly armored with spears and shields, probably axes or maces for close-in work. If they wore armor, it was probably leather, although it looks like at least some of them wore bronze helmets. But where Mesopotamia and Egyptian infantry tended to be more heavy infantry fighting with spears in formations and fewer archers, it looks like Vedic infantry was weighted the opposite way, with more archers and fewer spears. And unlike the nations of the Middle East, it looks like Vedic soldiers provided their own equipment rather than having it issued by the state. That's going to make armies smaller, and it's going to mean you have proportionally fewer poor bastard draftees and more elite warrior aristocrats. Cavalry would have generally acted as messengers or fought as light cavalry, mostly as mounted archers. Some of them would have been armed with spears and axes, but we're still a long way from true heavy cavalry. Because in order for a cavalryman to successfully charge a target that's ready to resist him, he needs a way to brace himself against his horse. Without that, the shock of impact with his target could send him sliding off the horse's rump. That makes him a little less effective than he might be otherwise. There are ways to prevent that don't require stirrups, but we don't see a lot of true heavy cavalry before guys start using stirrups to stabilize their seats in the charge. And these guys wouldn't have had stirrups. Another interesting point about the Vedic cavalry is the horsemen may not have fought as units, but just as individuals. Back to the warrior aristocrat thing there. Which probably means this was the smallest of the branches, because an army doesn't need that many messengers. And a bunch of guys riding around with bows, but without anybody coordinating their efforts, won't be much more than a nuisance on the battlefield. The third branch is the chariots. You've seen these before already. These would have looked a lot like their counterparts in Mesopotamia, since the design of their chariots came from pretty much the same place as the chariots the Hittites and Egyptians and Babylonians used. A basket on wheels pulled by two horses with an archer and a driver in the back. You'd probably see more horses pulling chariots than carrying archers, especially in flat river valley and arid areas like we're talking about today. And as we go east and south into India, we're going to see fewer of these guys. Chariots need flat ground to operate, so in highland areas or heavy vegetation, they're pretty much useless. But you know what's not useless? Elephants. This is the type of military force we haven't seen yet. The IVC domesticated elephants around 2500 BCE, so they were already using them by the time the Aryans showed up. These guys would have filled the niche of heavy cavalry on Vedic battlefields, because for the purposes of the Bronze Age, an elephant is basically a tank. It's big enough to carry maybe 3 or 4 guys on its back, so you have one driver and multiple archers shooting from what's already an elevated platform. And when you need to break your enemy's line, well, it takes a special kind of infantryman to stand in front of a charging elephant and not get the hell out of the way. They're not as fast as horses, but they're a lot tougher. They're also more expensive and harder to raise, so you don't see nearly as many of them as you do chariots. So why didn't the Near East learn how to use elephants if they're so great? We know from a few of our sources that there were wild elephants in Syria. Well, the short answer is they just didn't. The fact that an animal exists in a region doesn't mean the people who live there are going to figure out how to domesticate it. The longer answer is probably that the elephants of Africa and the Middle East weren't suitable for domestication. African elephants are a different species than the Asian variety, larger and ornerier. They don't like humans nearly as much as their Asian cousins. It's a little like the difference between cattle and bison. One is relatively more docile and easier to domesticate, and the other one is much more powerful and has very little tolerance for small two-legged critters running around trying to tell them where to go and putting hot metal on their asses. So there's our background. Let's get to the battle. No shit, there they were. As we've seen so many times in this series so far, there's just not that much information about the Battle of the Ten Kings. The Bharatas were an Indo-Aryan tribe that lived in the Indus River Valley. Their king Sudas led them in battle against a coalition of several nearby tribes and defeated them in what must have been a significant battle, especially for the time. But that doesn't give us much. Maybe if I read ancient Sanskrit, I could get a little more out of the Rigveda text, but I don't. So I have to rely on people who understand it a little better than I do. So let's dig a little and see if we can find a little more. One of the sources I looked at says Sudas dismissed his chief priest, whose name was Vishwamitra, and it was Vishwamitra who raised the coalition against Sudas. The rest don't mention who the leader of the coalition was. A couple of sources say Sudas defeated the coalition army by breaking a river dike, and the resulting flood drowned most of his enemies. Then he fought a battle against the remaining tribe and defeated them shortly afterward. Another source I saw said that the coalition army tried to redirect a river to force the Bharatas out. So there's a lot of question marks here. None of it's implausible. There's nothing here like we see in the Chinese legends, like the battles of Bangshuan and Zhuolu, if you remember those, where one guy called a rainstorm and the other one blew fog out of his nostrils. To me, it seems like the lack of supernatural intervention in this story makes it more likely that it may really have happened. But if it really happened, how did it happen? Well, I kind of like the story of the powerful man who lost his power and raised an army to try and get it back. That's a story we're going to hear a bunch more times. And sometimes it'll work out for him, and sometimes it won't. But that story isn't complete for me, because it doesn't talk about why he was fired in the first place, nor why he figured the best way to respond was to raise an army. So we need a little more context. And to get it, we're going to have to make it up. So Sudas is a young king, mid-20s maybe, who just inherited the throne of the Bharatas a couple of years ago. And one of the things he inherited with the throne was this priest, Vishwamitra. Now Sudas and Vishwamitra never really liked each other. Sudas is young and ambitious and energetic, and the valleys he controls are getting crowded, and his people need more space. And he wants to start sending scouts east to see if there's another river valley he can settle some of his people in. But Vishwamitra is in his 40s, and he likes being the people's spiritual leader, and he doesn't much like the idea of riding all the way out to a whole nother valley to bring guidance to the people who just won't worship right without his wise counsel. And he helped build Sudas's father into the great king he became, and he never let Sudas forget the part he played in building the Bharatas into the great people they are today. And what's more, he doesn't approve of the direction Sudas has taken the tribe. And he never fails to mention when he thinks the kid is fucking everything up, even in front of the council of elders. But the tribe has prospered under Sudas's leadership, and he has the elders on his side. And to be honest, several of them are tired of Vishwamitra's shit. So finally, Sudas tells the priest it's time for him to retire, and he'll be elevating one of the more junior priests in his place. He's welcome to stay with the tribe, and Sudas will make sure he's treated with all the respect and honor due to him. But it's time to get the fuck out. Well, Vishwamitra wants no part of this deal, and he tells the kid in no uncertain terms that he's not going anywhere. But when 9 of the 12 elders echo the king's wishes, and the other 3 keep their mouths shut, he realizes this is not a negotiation. It's a done deal. Well, Vishwamitra is feeling betrayed, and he refuses to stick around even one more night. He packs his elephants, and he and his household are out of there. And Sudas and the elders breathe a sigh of relief that he's out of their hair. And Sudas gets to work finding new territory for his people. They push out into the next valley, find only a few families there, and settle down. The old residents seem fine with the arrangement, especially when the Bharatas share their food with them. A few more years pass, and the Bharatas need to push over to the next river valley. But this one doesn't go as smoothly. There's already a village there, 30 families in that valley, and the leader of the Bharatas expansion team isn't nearly as patient as the first guy, and he doesn't have as good control over his men. And before anybody knows things are going sideways, arrows are flying, and 1 Bharata soldier and 10 residents of the valley are dead. Well, Sudas rides over with an honor guard and his high priest to see what he can do to salvage the situation. But the damage is done, and the residents of the town have brought their own king in with his honor guard, and things are getting tense. Sudas manages to mollify the king with some lavish gifts. But when he settles his people at the other end of the valley, the old residents attack. And when his people counterattack, they destroy the village and kill almost everybody. Well, so much for peaceful coexistence. Suda stations a garrison in the valley to help deal with any reprisals that might come from the other tribe. And a couple of weeks later, heavy rains start falling and falling and falling. And he's focused on securing his people and their food through the rains, and he's not prepared when the message comes. One of his mounted messengers gallops into his capital, out of breath, carrying a message that the leader of the tribes wants to speak to him. Leader of the tribes? The Bharatas are the most powerful tribe around. If there was a more powerful leader nearby, Suda would have heard of him. Curious, he gathers up his honor guard and heads to the new valley. And much to his surprise, there's Vishwamitra at the meeting place, with leaders of several of the local tribes behind him. Suda has broken the peace, he says, and the gods are angry. It's time for him to step aside and let Vishwamitra add the Bharatas to his coalition. Under his guidance, together the tribes can appease the gods and stop the rain. Well, Suda will be damned before he gives in to this cocksucker. He sends another messenger back to his capital, telling his elders to raise the army and send it to him. If Vishwamitra wants to rule, he's going to have to earn it. Now, Vishwamitra's coalition probably could have gotten what they wanted if they had attacked immediately. With just his honor guard and the valley garrison there, the coalition probably could have overwhelmed him. But they knew his tribe was the strongest in the region, and they couldn't bring themselves to agree to attack with most of the Bharata's strength back in the capital. After all, what if they attacked and killed Suda, and then his people raised a new king and came after him with the rest of the army? Yeah, Vishwamitra was not what you'd call an inspirational leader. So the 10 coalition kings headed back to their capitals to raise the rest of their own armies. If they faced Suda with their full strength, together, they'd be strong enough to beat the Bharatas. But they took too long, and by the time they were ready to march, Suda had already chosen the battlefield and been waiting for him for 2 days. He had chosen the upper end of a broad valley between two arms of a meandering river, swollen by the rains that just wouldn't stop falling. Vishwamitra marched the kings and their armies right into the valley, deploying them into battle formations in spite of the mud. After all, it'd hamper the Bharatas just as much as it would the 10 kings. And with the armies of his enemies arrayed on the plain below him, Suda gave the signal to his engineers, who had been digging away furiously at the natural dike at the bend upstream, substituting wooden supports for the tons of rock and dirt that had kept the river in its banks until now. His elephants pulled the beams away, and the river did the rest, flowing down into the valley while he and his troops stood safe on the high ground. Vishwamitra and most of the kings and their armies were swept away by the flood. All but one of the 10 kings, Beda, and the remnants of his army and 2 others. But the flood had driven all the fight out of Beda and the remaining men. They surrendered without a fight, acclaiming Suda king of all the peoples who were left. And Suda called for 3 days of celebration and immediately started trying to figure out how to get food and support to his new people. After the battle, all the local tribes consolidated into a new people who called themselves the Kuru, a coalition that looks like it became the first real state in India. The Kuru would control the area until about 500 BCE, so they would have a good long run after Suda brought them all together. How much of this story is real? Well, I've added a little meat to the bones to craft a story that at least seems plausible to me, but I really have no idea. Suda was probably real, but he might not have been the king that brought everybody together. The Bharatas were probably real. Some of the sources named the coalition tribes, but frankly, there's a lot more than 10 of them, and the names didn't seem important for this war story. Vishwamitra could be real, or he could be an invention to allow the storytellers to craft a morality tale out of a historical account. And the story of the river drowning the enemy army could be real. It could also have happened without human intervention, maybe drowning a bunch of the Bharatas along with the coalition tribes. Or maybe Suda fought a series of wars or battles that later got mashed up into this one story. It's really damn near impossible to know for sure. But this is what we have, and this is the war story I invented to make it plausible. And you won't be the least bit surprised to learn we don't have a scorecard today. As many details as I had to invent for this one, we're just not going to get there. So, if you enjoyed this war story, give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your fellow nerds about me. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.